The horrifying secret of the Lusitania. Death beneath the waves. A hook. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be trapped in the darkest depths of the ocean, hunted by an ancient creature from your worst nightmares? In this chilling tale, a man fights for his life aboard the ill-fated Lusitania. But what he doesn't know is that the terror doesn't end when the ship sinks. Will he escape, or will the sea claim him forever? Stay tuned till the end to discover the shocking truth behind the creature's hunt and the unexpected twist that will leave you breathless. Trust me, you won't see it coming. The wind howled across the Atlantic, a bitter, cold gust that seemed to cut through the thick fog. The Lusitania sliced through the dark waters, its massive hull glistening under the dim moonlight. Inside, passengers murmured softly, oblivious to the creeping tension that wrapped around the ship like a silent predator. A distant clang echoed from the bow, metal striking metal. No one knew exactly what had caused it, but for a split second, everyone paused. Then, the noise was swallowed by the vast emptiness. The air felt heavy, like it was charged with something unseen. A man in a dark suit walked briskly along the deck, his footsteps quick, hurried. He stopped suddenly, his face going pale. In the distance, faint lights flickered, like a warning. But no one paid attention. No one noticed the small shape that slid into the water, disappearing with hardly a ripple. Inside the grand dining hall, people laughed, their voices rising above the clinking of silverware. The ship seemed to hum, its engines powering forward with an unwavering rhythm. Then came the first jolt, a terrible, spine-shaking crash that split the air. The floor tilted. A scream pierced the chaos. Passengers scrambled, but the ship's movements were wild. Someone shouted, "A torpedo!" The word spread like wildfire. Panic surged through the crowd, hearts racing in terror. The ship groaned, buckled, as though it were a living thing in pain. Another explosion rocked the vessel, this one much closer. Windows shattered. Glass rained down like deadly confetti. The ship tilted more, a terrifying angle that no one had expected. Water began to pour in, swift and unforgiving. The screams of men and women echoed against the sound of rushing waves. The terror spread quickly, but some stayed frozen. One man stood by a window, staring out. His hands trembled. He saw them, shadows moving in the dark water below. A flash of something beneath the surface. Was it a ship? He couldn't tell. A voice behind him broke his gaze. "Help us, please." He turned. A woman, pale and trembling, clung to the railing. Her voice was shaking, pleading, but his feet wouldn't move. The ship tilted again. It felt like the end. In the midst of the terror, the man was suddenly aware of the silence. Not a single scream, not a single cry. Just the rushing of the waves and then nothing. A shadow moved across the deck. Something large, heavy. The lights flickered, then went out. A heartbeat of darkness. Before everything shifted, the deck groaned, as though the ship were protesting its fate. A terrible, wrenching sound echoed from below, like the belly of a beast being torn open. The man's breath quickened. He turned, searching the darkness. The sound of water rushing in grew louder, more insistent. Then a splash, heavy like something or someone had hit the water from above. The woman's grip tightened on the railing, her knuckles white. She turned her head, eyes wide with terror. "Is anyone coming?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the chaos. The man couldn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the water. It shimmered in the dark, the surface now alive with movement. Something was emerging, a figure swimming toward the ship. But it wasn't a person. It was something else, a shape that shouldn't have been there. The woman gasped, stepping back. The man felt a chill crawl up his spine, his breath shallow. What was it? The shape moved closer, faster now. and then a voice, a scream. It wasn't human. It was an agonized, gurgling wail that seemed to twist the very air. The ship lurched again, its steel frame groaning as it struggled to stay afloat. Another explosion, closer this time, rattled the air, making the ship shake violently. The man stumbled, falling to his knees, gripping the wet deck. His eyes never left the water. The figure rose, half submerged, half grotesque, its face twisted, unrecognizable. A shadow passed over the man's face, and suddenly the air around him was freezing cold. The woman screamed, pointing to the horizon. The silhouette of a ship, dark and indistinct, was moving toward them. But no one could see its flag. No one could hear its engines. It was as though it was simply there. The man's heart pounded, his chest tightening. He looked down at his shaking hands, then back to the water. The shape was closer now, and this time the man saw the eyes. Cold, dead, staring right at him, the man's breath caught in his throat. The eyes, hollow, empty, locked onto his. A low, guttural sound bubbled from the figure's throat. The woman behind him whimpered, too terrified to move. The cold air pressed in, suffocating. The figure's form shifted in the water, its limbs unnaturally long, dragging through the waves with an eerie grace. Every instinct screamed to run, but his body refused to obey. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant cries of others on the ship. The man felt something brush his leg. His body froze. It was too real, too close. A touch, something slick and cold. He jerked away, but the figure's eyes remained fixed on him. A shadow passed over the deck. The massive ship groaned again, leaning at a steep angle, as if protesting its impending doom. The water continued to rise. The man glanced around, but everything was chaos. Screams, desperate cries, the splashing of frantic passengers trying to escape. But no help, no escape. The cold, heavy weight of inevitability pressed on him. The woman beside him was now gone, her voice swallowed by the storm, her figure lost in the madness. The man stood alone at the railing, staring down into the dark abyss. The shape was now beneath the ship, circling, waiting. Something in his gut told him this wasn't a coincidence. This was no accident. Another scream echoed from the depths. The figure's face surfaced again, and this time it was closer. A hideous grin stretched across its disfigured features. The man stumbled backward. His heart pounded so hard, he thought it might burst, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. The creature was reaching up, long, clawed hands breaking the surface of the water. The Lusitania groaned once more, and then, in one final, soul-shaking moment, the ship lurched. The deck pitched sharply. The man's feet lost contact with the ground. He was thrown into the air, his body weightless for a brief, horrifying second. And then, darkness. The world went silent. The cold water hit him like a wall. He gasped, choking, as the salt water surged into his mouth. His limbs flailed, but the current was stronger. The waves crashed over him, pulling him down deeper. His lungs burned, the cold freezing his very bones. He fought to the surface, spluttering, desperate for air. The ship loomed above him, a giant, sinking into the abyss. He could hear the creaking of its metal, the cries of those still trapped on board. The water was thick with debris, wood, glass, shattered metal bodies. He pushed it all away, kicking, swimming. His eyes darted across the dark water. Nothing. But then, there it was again, a ripple, barely noticeable, cutting through the darkness. The shape. It was moving toward him, faster now. The same grotesque figure from before. Its hands, long and webbed, reached out, swiping through the water with terrifying precision. The man tried to scream, but only water filled his mouth. He scrambled to swim, but his body was exhausted. His mind screamed for escape, for anything that could save him. But there was nowhere to go. The creature was nearly upon him now. The face broke through the surface, twisted, grinning. Its teeth were jagged, sharp, a snarl frozen in time. Its eyes, those cold, hollow eyes, were locked on his. The man could feel the cold spreading through him, reaching into his very core. A clawed hand shot out. The man barely managed to twist his body, avoiding its grip, but it wasn't fast enough. The creature's other hand seized his ankle. A sharp pain shot through his leg as its claws dug in. He screamed, kicking and thrashing, but the grip tightened, pulling him down. The darkness around him deepened, swallowing him whole. He could barely see anything anymore, only the cold, endless blackness of the sea. The creature's cold breath washed over his face. And then, all at once, it was over. The world spun, twisted, and everything faded into nothing. The darkness was suffocating, silent, oppressive. Then came the sound, a distant echo, like a bell tolling in the abyss. It was faint at first, then louder, a rhythmic thudding, like a heartbeat. The man's limbs twitched, but he couldn't move. His body was heavy, like it was made of lead. Slowly, painfully, he became aware of his surroundings. A flicker of light, dim, wavering. He tried to open his eyes, but his eyelids felt like stone. Finally, with a sharp, painful effort, his eyes fluttered open. The light was strange, blue, almost unnatural. He was no longer in the water, no longer drowning. Instead, he was on something solid, a floor, cold and smooth. His body trembled with exhaustion, yet his mind raced. Where was he? His head ached, his thoughts cloudy. He tried to move, but his arms and legs felt paralyzed. The air smelled wrong, stale, stagnant, like something ancient, decaying. A groan echoed from somewhere above him, a low, throaty sound that seemed to resonate in the very walls around him. The man's breath quickened as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. The space around him was unfamiliar. Dark stone walls, towering and imposing. It was a chamber, a place no ship should have. Where was the Lusitania? Where was everyone else? His heart hammered in his chest. He could hear something moving just out of sight. Soft, scraping noises. Then the sound of breathing, slow, deliberate. A shadow crossed the room. Something massive. A form that loomed, heavy and unnatural. The man's pulse quickened. He tried to speak, but his voice betrayed him, dry and cracked. W? The question died on his lips. The shadow stopped. A cold chill washed over him. Colder than the ocean, colder than death itself. A pair of glowing eyes emerged from the darkness, fixated on him. And a voice, distorted and almost familiar. You should have never come back. The voice echoed in the chamber, chilling the man to his core. It wasn't human. It was a growl, an unnatural rasp that made the air itself tremble. His heart pounded wildly in his chest, each beat a deafening drum. The glowing eyes narrowed, fixing on him with an intensity that burned. He couldn't look away. The shadow shifted, revealing more of its shape. A grotesque figure, tall and skeletal, cloaked in tattered darkness. It moved with a twisted, jerky motion, like something half-formed. The man's breath caught in his throat. Who are you? He managed to whisper, his voice shaking. The creature cocked its head, as if considering him. You do not belong here, it rasped. Its voice was a mixture of whispers and growls, as if many voices had merged into one. The man's mind raced, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. He had no memory of how he had ended up here. No recollection of escaping the water, of what had happened to the ship. The creature's eyes glowed brighter now, casting an eerie light on the cold stone walls. You brought it here, the voice hissed. Brought what? The man gasped. The creature's lips curled into something resembling a smile, but it was a grin of malice, twisted and cruel. The shadow moved closer, its presence overwhelming. The man could feel the air around him growing colder with each step it took. The death, it whispered. The death of the Lusitania. The death of you. The man's heart skipped a beat. What did it mean? The creature's clawed fingers extended toward him, each movement slow and deliberate. You didn't die, it said softly, almost mockingly. You should have drowned, but you didn't. The man's breath caught. He could barely process the words. What are you? He whispered. But the creature only smiled wider, its teeth jagged, glowing with an unnatural light. A cold, terrifying silence followed. And then, without warning, it lunged. The man's legs screamed in pain as he pushed himself to his feet. The air grew thick, oppressive, like the very walls were closing in around him. He stumbled, barely able to keep his balance, but he couldn't stop. The creature snarled, its form flickering in and out of view like a mirage, but it was still there, looming, its glowing eyes fixed on him. The ground rumbled again. The man's gaze shot to the flicker of light he had seen earlier. There, at the far end of the chamber, was an opening, dark, narrow, but enough for him to escape through. Without thinking, he surged toward it, ignoring the sharp pain in his shoulder and the dizziness that clouded his vision. Behind him, the creature screeched. It sounded like something between a growl and a scream, raw and filled with fury. The man didn't dare look back. He reached the opening, barely squeezing through, his body scraping against the rough stone. His fingers clawed at the walls for purchase as the ground continued to shake beneath him. It was as if the entire place was coming apart. The air was thick with dust now, swirling in choking clouds. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he pushed forward, forcing himself through the tight space. The flickering light ahead grew brighter, and he could see the outline of another tunnel beyond the opening. The walls felt softer here, like a different material, less stone, more organic. In the tunnel, desperate to find an exit, but there was no end in sight. It seemed endless, the walls narrowing as he continued to push through. Then, ahead, another flash of light, a crack in the stone, a glimmer of something. He rushed toward it, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he reached the light, a sudden force slammed into his back, knocking him forward. He barely caught himself against the stone wall. The creature had followed. Its claws scraped across the tunnel floor, sending sparks flying as it dragged itself toward him. The man gasped, panic flooding his senses. He couldn't outrun it. Not like this. The creature let out a low, guttural laugh. You are mine now, it whispered. Its breath was cold, colder than the deepest night. The man pressed himself against the wall, his hand trembling as he searched for anything that could help him fight back. There was nothing. Nothing except the darkness closing in around him. The creature's form loomed closer, its eyes glowing brighter in the narrow tunnel. Its claws scraped against the stone, a sound like nails on a chalkboard, sending a chill through his bones. The man's breath came in shallow gasps, his body trembling with fear. The light from the crack in the wall flickered, barely offering any comfort. He was trapped. There was no way out. The creature's mouth opened wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, its lips curling into a twisted grin. You can't hide from me, it rasped, its voice echoing off the walls. The man backed away, his feet stumbling over the uneven ground. His mind raced, but every thought felt sluggish, clouded by panic. And then an idea, a desperate, dangerous idea. Without a second thought, he turned and dashed for the crack in the wall, ignoring the searing pain in his leg. He squeezed through as fast as he could, his body scraping against the rough edges. The creature screeched behind him, its claws slashing through the air, but he was already beyond reach. For a brief moment, he thought he was free, but the crack opened into another chamber, a massive, dark void. The air was thick with a strange, acrid smell, like rotting metal and salt water. And there, in the center of the chamber, was something that made his blood run cold. A massive structure, towering, ominous, and impossibly ancient. It was like nothing he had ever seen, a hybrid of metal and stone, twisted and warped as if time itself had eroded it. The creature's laughter echoed behind him, sending a wave of dread down his spine. He turned quickly, realizing the tunnel had sealed itself behind him. No escape now. The creature was there, too, its eyes burning with hatred. It slowly advanced toward him, its presence filling the space with an unbearable weight. "You cannot outrun what is already in your soul," it hissed. The man's mind raced. What was it talking about? What did it mean by his soul? He looked around desperately, searching for something, anything, to help him fight back. His eyes fell on the massive structure in the center of the room. It was pulsating with an eerie, dim light, as if it were alive. Without thinking, he ran toward it, hoping that it held some clue to his survival. As he approached, he felt a strange pull, a magnetic force drawing him closer. He didn't understand why, but it felt as though the structure was beckoning him. The creature screeched from behind, its claws scraping against the stone floor. But the man's feet kept moving, drawn to the structure like a moth to a flame. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the surface. Cold, but not just cold, alive. A pulse thrummed beneath his fingers, like the heartbeat of something ancient, something powerful. And then suddenly he felt it, a rush of memories flooding his mind. Visions, the Lusitania sinking, the darkness of the sea, the creature, and the undeniable truth. He had never left. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, cold and overwhelming. He had never left. The ship, the sea, the sinking, everything had been a part of this place. A nightmare, a loop, a prison. The man's hand trembled against the pulsating surface of the structure as memories flooded his mind, fragments of the past intertwining with the present. He remembered the terror on the deck, the screams, the chaos. He remembered the shape in the water, the cold grip that had pulled him under. But now he understood. It wasn't just the Lusitania that had sunk. It was him. His soul had never left the depths of the sea. It was trapped here, in this place, this twisted reflection of the world above. The creature was a part of it, a manifestation of the horrors that had claimed them all. The man's breath quickened, his body growing weak with the weight of the truth. The air around him seemed to tighten, suffocating. His mind screamed for escape, but there was nowhere to go. The creature was closing in. Its form flickered, shifting like a shadow in the darkness. "You cannot outrun what is already inside you," it repeated, its voice low and mocking. The man backed away from the structure, his mind racing for a way out. But there was no escape from this place, no way to undo what had been done. The creature stepped closer, its claws gleaming in the dim light. "You should have drowned," it hissed, its breath cold and fetid. "You should have never come back." The man's heart pounded in his chest as the creature's form loomed larger, closer. But then, as the darkness seemed to swallow him whole, a faint sound reached his ears. A whisper, a voice, distant but clear. "Wake up." The words echoed in his mind, filling him with a sudden surge of strength. His body trembled, but he clenched his fists, refusing to succumb to the creature's grip. The whisper came again. "Wake up." This time he understood. It wasn't a place of death he was trapped in. It was a place of his own making, a reflection of the terror that had consumed him, the fear that had held him under. He closed his eyes, focused on the sound of the voice. With a final, desperate push, he reached for the structure once more. This time he didn't touch it. He tore his hand away, forcing himself to break free from the pull. The world around him began to shift, the walls of the chamber warping, dissolving. The creature let out a screech of rage, but it was fading into nothing. The man's breath caught in his throat as he felt the ground beneath him start to break apart. The world was crumbling, but now he was free. The man's vision blurred, the crumbling world around him becoming a whirlwind of shadows and light. He stumbled, his body struggling to stay upright, as the walls dissolved into mist. The ground beneath his feet gave way, but instead of falling, he felt himself rising, lifted by an invisible force. The whisper was stronger now, clearer. "Wake up." The words pulsed through him like a heartbeat. He focused on the sound, pushing everything else aside. The creature's screech grew fainter, its presence slipping away as though it were never truly there. The darkness began to clear. His body felt lighter, the weight of the nightmare lifting from his chest. And then, suddenly, he was no longer in the chamber. He was back in the real world. The cold sting of sea air filled his lungs as he opened his eyes. The light of the moon was soft against the horizon. The Lusitania was still there, its massive form sailing gracefully across the dark waters. The deck was calm, the sounds of passengers moving peacefully through the ship. It was as if nothing had happened, but he knew it had. He could feel it, the heavy weight of the memories, the terror that still lingered at the edges of his mind. He touched his face, his body, checking for any trace of the nightmare. Nothing, but it felt different. The world felt unreal. He was no longer the man he had been before the sinking. He knew that now. The ship continued its voyage, the gentle hum of its engines the only sound in the quiet night. And yet, deep within him, something had changed. The man walked to the edge of the deck, leaning over the railing to look out at the endless ocean. The water shimmered beneath the moonlight, calm and still, as though nothing had ever disturbed it. But as he stared into the depths, he saw it. A flicker in the water, a shape moving beneath the surface. His breath caught in his throat. He stepped back, a cold chill creeping over his skin. And then, far below, he saw it, those glowing eyes, staring up at him. The creature was still there, waiting. The man's heart skipped a beat, his pulse hammering in his chest. He stepped back from the railing, his legs unsteady beneath him. The glowing eyes were unmistakable, piercing through the blackness of the ocean, locked on him. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath, but the air around him felt thick with dread. His mind raced. Could it be real? Had the nightmare somehow bled into reality? No, it couldn't be. Yet the eyes in the water didn't fade. They remained fixed on him, unblinking, unrelenting. The ship creaked beneath him, the sound of its steady motion lulling the passengers around him into a false sense of safety. But he couldn't shake the feeling. Something was terribly wrong. The man's gaze stayed locked on the water, and as he watched, the shape in the depths grew clearer, a form, dark and shifting, moving with an unnatural grace just beneath the surface. His hands clenched the railing so tightly his knuckles whitened. Was it the creature? Had it followed him here? The whisper in his mind returned, soft and insistent. "Wake up." The man shook his head, struggling to make sense of it all. He was awake, wasn't he? This was real. But as he looked down again, the figure in the water moved closer. It rose, surfacing in slow, deliberate motions. He could see it now, its twisted form breaking the surface, rippling with the same eerie glow that had haunted his dreams. The same eyes, the same horrible grin. The man's breath hitched. There was no escaping it. He knew that now. He couldn't run from what had happened, from the terror that had consumed him. The creature's face surfaced completely, its jagged, hollow eyes staring up at him, its grin stretching impossibly wide. A low, gurgling laugh echoed across the water, filling the air with a haunting sound. The man stepped back from the edge, trembling, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. "You should have drowned," the creature whispered, its voice slipping through the air like poison. "Now you are mine." The ship shuddered beneath him, a violent, unnatural tremor that rattled every beam, every plank. He felt the deck beneath his feet tilt, just slightly, as if the weight of something ancient and massive was pressing down on it. His legs buckled. The ground felt unstable, as if the ship itself was sinking into the sea. He grabbed onto the railing again, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. The eyes in the water remained fixed on him. And now it was clear this was not just a nightmare. It was his fate. The Lusitania was doomed, as was he. The creature's presence, its grip on his soul, had followed him back into the waking world, and there was no escaping it now. It would drag him back down into the depths, just like the ship, just like the countless souls lost that night. No one ever truly escaped the Lusitania. The deck lurched beneath his feet, the trembling of the ship growing more intense with each passing second. The man clung to the railing, his fingers numb with fear, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the water below. The creature's grin widened, stretching unnaturally, as though it were savoring his terror. Its long, gnarled hands broke the surface, reaching upward, fingers curling toward him like claws. A low, gurgling laugh rose from the depths, a sound that sent a jolt of icy dread through his entire body. It was as though the sea itself was alive and angry, and it had come to claim him. The man's thoughts raced. There had to be something he could do. He wasn't going to let this thing pull him under again. But every instinct in him screamed to run, to flee, to escape the crushing grip of inevitability that loomed over him. The ship groaned louder now, creaking as if its very structure were being torn apart by an unseen force. The man's vision blurred, the air thickening with a damp, acrid stench, as though the sea had risen from the depths to claim its due. Suddenly, the ship tilted sharply, as if the weight of the water itself was dragging it into the abyss. He lost his balance, stumbling, barely catching himself against the railing. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure standing near the lifeboats, silhouetted against the moonlit sky. A woman. Her face was pale, drawn, as though she had seen something no one should ever see. She locked eyes with him, and in that instant he knew. She had seen it too. She had seen the creature. She had felt its pull. "Get away!" she screamed, her voice desperate. But it was too late. The ship groaned again, and this time it was a sickening, splintering sound, as if the wood itself was being ripped apart. The man's body was frozen in place, unable to move as the creature's glowing eyes pierced through the darkness, now even closer, now impossibly near. Its laugh grew louder, filling his ears, drowning out everything else. Then, with one last desperate cry, the woman's form vanished into the shadow of the ship, swallowed by the sea, as if she too had become a part of the Lusitania's cursed history. The man felt his heart skip a beat. No, he wasn't going to let the ship drag him down again. But even as he turned to run, the world around him was no longer the same. The deck was shifting, the air thick with salt and decay. The creature's presence was suffocating, its cold grip closing in on him. It was everywhere now. The very walls of the ship seemed to bend, to twist, as if reality itself was unraveling. The man turned toward the edge of the ship, the water below now churning violently, as if it were alive, hungry for what had been promised to it. A sharp cry, his own, pierced the air as the ship tilted more, throwing him against the railing. But this time it felt different. This time it felt final. The darkness closed in, heavy and suffocating. It pressed down on him like the weight of the ocean itself. The man's body was numb, his thoughts slow and clouded. He could feel the water rising, cold and consuming, enveloping him in a deep, terrifying silence. No light, no sound, just the deafening stillness of the deep. But then, through the suffocating void, a faint whisper reached him. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "Wake up." The voice again. That same voice he had heard in the nightmare. The same whisper that had tried to pull him from the creature's grasp. But this time it felt different, urgent, desperate. His mind clung to the sound, the only lifeline in the ocean of black. He tried to move, tried to force his limbs to respond, but they felt frozen, paralyzed. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Wake up." The man gasped, a sharp breath flooding his lungs, but he felt no air. He opened his eyes, only to be met by nothing but blackness, deep and endless. A cold grip wrapped around his throat, pulling him deeper into the dark, but his heart still thudded, pounding in his chest. The whisper turned into a command, sharp and insistent. "Wake up." And then, with a force that shattered his bones, he was pulled from the depths. Suddenly he was falling, tumbling through the air, his body jerking violently. The harsh light of the sun struck his eyes, blinding him for a moment. He gasped again, and this time he felt real air in his lungs. He was back on the deck of the Lusitania. But everything was wrong. The ship was alive with movement, but it wasn't the same. The passengers around him moved in slow motion, their faces frozen in expressions of horror, their eyes wide with terror. The world was out of sync, as if time itself was unraveling. The man's heart raced, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He looked around, his body shaking. Was this real? Or was it another part of the nightmare? The whisper came again, not in his mind this time, but in his ears, close, too close. "Get off the ship." Now, the voice was no longer soft or distant. It was harsh, demanding. He turned, frantic, searching for the source. And there, standing in front of him, was the woman. The same pale, drawn figure from before. Her face was gaunt, her eyes wide and frantic. "You have to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "Leave before it's too late." But before he could respond, the ship shook again, more violently than before. The lights flickered. The air grew heavy, with an unnatural chill. The creature's presence was suffocating, its cold, malicious grip surrounding him. The man felt the floor beneath him tremble, and before he could move, the world shifted. The Lusitania was no longer a ship. It was a sinking tomb. The walls of the ship cracked, the floor splintered, and the sea surged upward, swallowing everything in its path. The creature was there again, its eyes glowing, its twisted form rising from the depths of the ship. The man's legs gave way beneath him as the floor tilted, throwing him into the cold, dark water below. And as the sea closed over him once more, the whisper came again. This time, it was a final, fading breath. "Wake up before it's too late." The darkness swallowed him whole. Cold, crushing darkness. The weight of the water pressed against him, pulling him deeper into the abyss. His chest ached, fighting for air, but it was useless. His body sank, helpless, as if the very sea had claimed him. But the whisper came again, clearer this time, stronger. "Wake up." He gasped for breath, or at least tried to. His lungs burned, his limbs heavy and unresponsive. But that voice, that final plea, cut through the fog. It wasn't a voice of comfort. It wasn't a voice of guidance. It was desperation. He clenched his fists, his vision clouding as the water closed in around him. Was this it? Was he really going to drown, to be consumed by the sea and the creature that haunted his every thought? But something deep within him refused to let go. He had fought so hard, so relentlessly, against this nightmare. He couldn't stop now. The whisper came again, echoing through his mind, growing louder, almost frantic. "Wake up. Now." And then, with an explosion of force, he surged forward. His body shot up, propelled by some unseen force, as if the very ocean had rejected his presence. He fought the pull, his arms thrashing through the water, desperate for the surface. The pressure on his chest grew unbearable, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. With a final, desperate effort, his head broke through the surface. Gasping for air, his lungs burned, and the bitter salt of the sea filled his mouth. But he was alive. He was awake. The sky above him was vast, infinite, and yet there was no comfort in it. The ship, the Lusitania, it was gone. He was alone. The water around him was still, eerily calm, the moonlight casting a cold glow across the sea. The nightmare had ended, or so it seemed. But as he floated there, gasping and shivering, he felt something stir in the depths below. A presence. The same presence that had haunted him, that had haunted the ship. The creature was down there waiting, watching. His heart raced as he scanned the water, his breath shallow, his senses on edge. And then there it was, a flicker in the dark, something moving beneath the surface. The eyes, glowing, predatory, impossibly deep. The creature's laugh echoed through the water, hollow and cruel. "You can't escape me," it whispered, its voice like cold death. The man's chest tightened. The horror, the terror, everything he had fought against, it was still here. He had woken up. But the nightmare had never truly ended. The Lusitania, the creature, the endless cycle, they were a part of him now. A curse, a fate. And no matter how far he swam, no matter how hard he fought, he could never escape the sea. The man's limbs felt weak as the creature's presence pressed against him, like an iron grip. The water around him seemed to close in, suffocating him with its dark, endless expanse. Every instinct screamed for him to swim, to flee, but his body was paralyzed, rooted in place by the overwhelming force of the creature's gaze. Its eyes glowed beneath the surface, watching him with unblinking malice. The laugh came again, low and mocking, reverberating through the stillness of the night, pushing toward the surface. Its presence was all-encompassing, consuming him entirely. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The weight of it was unbearable. But just as his mind threatened to snap under the pressure, something changed. A shift in the air, a ripple in the water, and then he saw it. A faint light, distant but growing stronger. It cut through the darkness like a beacon. A chance, a glimpse of hope. With a surge of desperate energy, he kicked, forcing his body to move, to fight against the crushing weight of the sea. His muscles screamed in protest, but he ignored the pain. He swam toward the light. The water around him swirled violently, pulling at his legs, tugging him back. But he pushed harder, faster, not caring if the creature was right behind him. The light grew closer. It was a ship, a vessel. The faint outline of it became clearer, its silhouette sharp against the night sky. A lifeline. His hope flared. He wasn't alone. He could escape. But as he neared the ship, a shadow stretched across the water, and the creature's eyes locked onto him once more. "No one escapes," it hissed, its voice filled with pure rage. The water around him began to churn violently, pulling him under, dragging him back into the depths. His heart raced. He was almost there, almost free. But the pull of the creature was stronger than he had imagined. It wrapped around him, its cold hands seizing his legs, pulling him down, down into the abyss. The ship loomed above him, the light now far out of reach, as the sea closed over his head once more. The creature's laughter filled the water, and the last thing he saw was its eyes, glowing with an inescapable hunger. And then nothing. The world turned black, the darkness enveloped him completely, the cold weight of the water pressing down on his chest as he sank deeper. His body felt heavy, suspended in the nothingness, and yet his mind screamed, thrashing in desperation. He couldn't breathe, but still he fought for air. The oppressive quiet of the depths was suffocating, and every thought felt like it was sinking along with him. The creature's laughter echoed in the distance, a cruel reminder that he was never truly free. Time, or what he understood of it, had lost meaning here. He could feel the pressure of the water rising around him, the sensation of being pulled into an endless void. But then, something shifted. A sudden shift in the water. A pulse, a light, faint but undeniable. The man's eyes flickered open, though everything around him remained dark. The cold sting of the sea, once so all-encompassing, seemed to recede, just for a moment. He gasped, his chest tight, as though he had been under the water for far too long. But the air was different now, clearer. It didn't make sense. He couldn't explain it. But somehow, he was moving again, rising from the depths, struggling against the pull of the creature that still gripped his soul. As his body broke the surface, he could hear it. Far in the distance, whispers. The voice. It was calling to him, not in the depths of the water, but above the waves. Wake up, before it's too late. He opened his eyes again, not fully understanding, but knowing that he had to follow it. The moonlight bathed him as he gasped for air, the world slowly beginning to take shape around him. The endless sea stretched out, still and silent. But there was something different in the air, something that hadn't been there before. He felt as though he was emerging from a dream, from a nightmare that had lasted far too long. And yet, the unease in his chest told him that something was still terribly wrong. The creature wasn't gone. It was waiting, just beneath the surface, watching him. His heart raced, panic clawing at his throat. But he swam forward, driven by that same desperate urge to escape. He didn't know if the ship was still out there, but he had to find it. He had to find something, anything, to remind him that this wasn't his reality. The water beneath him rippled, and for a moment, just a moment, he thought he saw the flash of a shadow in the depths. He stopped, his body tensing, the eyes glowing once again. He spun around, heart hammering, but the sea was still. No, it wasn't. It was moving. The water churned violently, as if the ocean itself was waking up. And then, through the growing disturbance, he saw it, rising from the deep, from the very heart of the sea. The creature, its massive form loomed before him, emerging from the abyss like a nightmare reborn. Its twisted, grotesque shape seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, and its eyes, those endless, glowing eyes, locked onto his, as though it had never left. The man's breath faltered as he realized the truth. There was no waking from this. There was no escape. The creature's jaws opened wide, and with one final, heart-stopping screech, it lunged. And the sea closed over him once again, the darkness swallowed him once more, the creature's weight pressing against him like a suffocating nightmare. The cold, stinging water surged around him, choking him, as if the sea itself was alive and hungry. His lungs burned, his body unable to move against the crushing force. Every instinct screamed for him to fight, to swim, to escape, but the power of the creature's presence was too much. Its enormous, twisted form loomed over him, its glowing eyes devouring his soul with a cold, insatiable hunger. He could feel its breath, foul and fetid, as it moved closer, wrapping its tendrils around his body like a predator, tightening its grip. His heart pounded in his chest, a desperate beat that only seemed to quicken as the creature closed in. And then, as the blackness pressed against him, something changed. A surge of energy not his own coursed through him. The whisper, it was there again. Wake up. This time it was more than a command. It was a plea, an overwhelming force that jolted through his body, forcing him to act. His eyes snapped open, though the water was thick with darkness. His body still held fast by the creature. But he couldn't stay here. He couldn't let it take him again. With everything he had left, he summoned what little strength remained, his arms breaking free of the creature's hold, kicking his legs furiously. The water around him seemed to push back, like a living wall, but he fought through it. A violent tug on his chest. The creature was pulling him down once more, But this time, he was ready. He twisted, thrashing, using every last ounce of strength to propel himself upward. The surface, the light. He could see it now, faint but growing clearer with each desperate kick. The creature's shriek echoed behind him, sharp and maddening, as it reached for him, its claws slicing through the water. But he didn't stop. He surged upward, toward the light, toward anything that wasn't the suffocating blackness of the sea. His hands broke the surface, and the air rushed into his lungs, cold and life-saving. He gasped, choking on the salty sea, but he didn't stop. He pushed forward, his heart still thundering in his chest. He was free. He had to be. But the water around him churned violently, the sea growing restless as though it had come alive with fury. The creature was not far behind. He could feel it. Its presence still hung heavy in the air, like a shadow beneath the surface, watching him, waiting for him to falter. He swam with everything he had, but the water was colder now, the waves rising higher, crashing with unnatural force. The whisper grew louder. "Wake up before it's too late." But he couldn't tell if it was the voice of salvation or a final warning. In the distance, a faint light flickered. A ship? A rescue? His mind clung to the hope, to the desperate belief that he could escape, that the nightmare could end. But the sea had other plans. The waves crashed higher, pulling him under again, dragging him back into the dark. And as the creature's eyes flashed beneath the water, the darkness closed over him once more. And this time, there was no escape. The cold water enveloped him like a tomb, swallowing him whole as the creature's shadow pressed closer, its eyes glowing with a terrible hunger. The man's limbs were sluggish, his body exhausted, but something within him still clung to life. He fought against the weight, against the suffocating force pulling him deeper. But his strength was waning. The dark waters twisted and writhed around him, as though the very sea was alive and intent on claiming him. The creature's presence was suffocating, pressing down on him from all sides. His heart thudded in his chest, each beat heavier than the last. The whisper came again, but it was different now, urgent, frantic. "Wake up! Wake up now!" The words cut through the water like a blade, piercing the darkness surrounding him. He didn't know if he could wake up anymore. Could he escape this nightmare? Could he truly escape the creature? The pressure around him was relentless, but his body moved almost instinctively, thrashing, fighting the pull of the deep. The surface was so far away, but his desperation fueled him. He surged upward, each movement slower, more labored, but he couldn't stop. The water churned, violent and unforgiving, but he pushed through, his chest aching for air. And then his hands broke the surface. The moonlight was blinding, but it didn't feel like the freedom he had hoped for. He gasped, his breath ragged, his body trembling with the effort to stay afloat. He was alive, but the nightmare wasn't over. The creature's roar echoed in the distance, rising from the depths, a sound that shook him to his core. He turned, eyes wild, searching for some sign of salvation. But the water around him seemed to stretch forever, a dark abyss with no end. And there, just beneath the surface, its eyes glowed again. The man's breath caught in his throat as the creature's shadow moved beneath him, slow and deliberate. It was circling him. It wasn't finished with him yet. His pulse quickened as the fear gripped him once more. Every instinct screamed at him to swim, to escape, but his body was weak, drained from the relentless struggle. And then, a ripple in the water. Something large broke the surface, something impossible. The creature's head. It was massive, its jagged teeth gleaming in the moonlight. Its eyes locked on him with malevolent intent. The man could see it now, its entire form emerging from the depths, a grotesque nightmare made real. He froze, unable to tear his eyes away. It was real. It had followed him. It had always been here. With a sudden surge of strength, he swam. No, he fled, his heart pounding, desperation flooding his veins. But the sea wasn't done with him. The waves crashed violently around him, dragging him down with each passing second. He fought, but the creature was faster, its enormous form closing in with terrifying speed. The water grew colder, colder than it ever had before. The sea tightened around him like an unforgiving vice, and the darkness rose again, consuming everything in its path. As the creature's monstrous jaws opened wide, the man realized there was no escape. This was the end, the Lusitania's curse, and he, too, would become another lost soul. The creature lunged, and the sea claimed him. The water was shockingly cold, colder than before, as if the sea itself had frozen in time. The man's body, battered and broken, floated in the depths, his limbs stiff and unresponsive. The weight of the water around him felt oppressive, suffocating. But the creature was still there. He could feel its presence, dark and looming just beneath the surface, waiting for the final moment. His heart, though slow, still beat. It was a steady, faint rhythm in the endless void. The sea whispered, but now it wasn't the same whisper. It was full of hunger, full of waiting. A soft lapping sound from the surface, followed by a silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. And then the light. A soft glow, like the distant echo of a lighthouse. The man didn't know how, but he could sense it, like a beacon that had always been there, hidden beneath the nightmare. A voice, different this time, reached him, soft but unmistakable. Not yet. The words barely registered at first, but they sliced through the depths of his consciousness like a lifeline. He wasn't done yet. With a burst of energy, he moved, his body fighting against the pull of the deep. His arms broke the surface first, followed by his chest, and then with a great heave, his head emerged. He gasped, the air sharp and cold in his lungs, filling him with a strange sense of clarity. The world above was vast, untouched by the horrors below. He blinked, the ocean's dark expanse now stretched out before him like a vast, uncharted wasteland. The sky was clearer than it had ever been, the stars above twinkling as if they knew what had happened. There was no sign of the ship, no hint of the creature's looming form. But there was something else, something he couldn't ignore. A ship, far in the distance, a silhouette against the horizon. The rescue? Or a trick of the mind. Wake up. Born from this time, it was more than a command. The man's heart was a plea as he began to swim. An overwhelming force pushing through the water through his body, renewed strength, forcing him. But there was no panic now. His eyes snapped open, no dark. Though the water was thick with darkness, the sea seemed still held fast by the creature, as though it were no longer interested in dragging him. He couldn't let it take him. The whisper returned with everything he had left. This time, he summoned what little strength remained, almost peaceful. His arms breaking free of the creature's hold, but not in kicking his legs furiously. It was a promise. The water around him, the man continued to swim back, closer like to the living wall, closer to the faint hope that he had not violent tug on his chest, that he had not. The creature was pulling him down once more. Lost to the Lusitania. But this time he was ready. The horizon loomed closer, thrashing, and the whisper grew using every last ounce of strength to propel himself upward. The sea faded into silence. The surface, the man's muscles ached as he swam. He could see it now, but he pushed forward, growing clearer with each taking him closer. The creature's shriek echoed behind him. The weight of the sea seemed to lift from his shoulders as it reached for him with every pull. Its claws slicing through the water. It wasn't the crushing darkness but anymore. He didn't stop. The cold water surged upward once an unyielding force, toward anything that wasn't like a current guiding him toward something. His hands broke the surface. The faint glow and the air rushed into his lungs, with each passing life-saving. The outline of the ship choking on the clearer against the horizon. But he didn't stop. His breath, ragged and strained, his heart began to steady as the overwhelming weight of terror he had seemed to lift. But the water around him was turned violently. The nightmare that had tormented him for so long, as though it had was no longer lurking in the depths. The creature, with a final desperate push, behind. His hand touched the hull of the ship. Its presence still hung heavy in the metal beneath his fingertips, like a shadow, sending a shiver through his body. He
waiting
clung
for
to
him to falter.
gasping for air.
He swam with everything
his heart
he
still
had.
racing, but
the
now
water
with a
was
sense of
colder
relief,
now,
of
the
safety.
waves rising
The
higher,
ship's deck loomed above
crashing
him,
with
a
unnatural
lifeline
force.
he never thought
The
he'd
whisper
reach.
grew louder.
He could hear voices,
"Wake up!"
muffled
before
at
it's
first,
too late,
then clearer.
but
he couldn't
man
tell
overboard
if it was the voice
someone
of
shouted,
salvation
or
a
a
final
urgent
warning.
In the
Full of
distance,
concern.
a
Strong
faint light
hands
flickered
reached
a
down,
ship,
a
pulling
rescue?
him from the water.
His mind
with
clung
a
to
strength
the hope
he didn't have left.
to the desperate
They hauled
belief
him onto
that
the
he
deck,
could escape,
and for a moment
that the
he
nightmare
just lay
could
there,
end.
trembling.
But the sea
his
had
body
other
exhausted
plans.
but alive.
The waves
The cool
crashed
night
higher,
air kissed his skin,
pulling him under again.
The faint sound of the waves
dragging him
below
back
now
into
a
the
gentle
dark.
lullaby.
And as the creature's eyes flashed beneath the water,
he looked up, seeing
the darkness
faces
closed
real
over him
faces
once
looking
more.
down at him.
And this time,
they weren't pale.
There was no
ghostly
escape.
figures.
The cold water
They weren't the
enveloped him
shadows
like a
from the
tomb,
Lusitania,
swallowing him whole.
They were
as
warm,
the creature's
alive,
shadow pressed
human.
closer.
For the first
Its
time in
eyes
what felt
glowing
like an
with a
eternity,
terrible hunger.
he didn't feel
The man's
like a
limbs
prisoner
were
of the
sluggish,
sea.
his
The
body
nightmare
exhausted.
was over,
But something
he
within
closed
him
his eyes,
still clung to
letting
life.
the weight of the
He fought against the
experience
weight,
finally sink
against
in.
the suffocating
The ship
force
was real,
pulling him deeper.
The voices were
but
real.
his strength was
He
waning.
had made it.
The dark
and as
waters
the ship
twisted
sailed
and writhed
forward
around
into
him,
the endless ocean,
as though the very
the
sea
man
was
felt
alive,
an overwhelming
alive
sense of
and
peace.
intent on
The
claiming
past,
him.
the creature's
terror,
presence was
the creature,
suffocating.
The
Pressing
Lusitania
down on him
was
from
behind him,
all sides.
and the sea,
his heart
once
thudded
a
in
place
his
of darkness,
chest, each
now
beat
seemed
heavier than the
vast with
last.
possibility.
The whisper came
for the
again,
first time in so
but
long.
it was
He
different
truly
now,
free.
urgent, frantic. Wake up now! The words cut through the water like a blade, piercing the darkness surrounding him. He didn't know if he could wake up anymore. Could he escape this nightmare? Could he truly escape the creature? The pressure around him was relentless, but his body moved almost instinctively, thrashing, fighting the pull of the deep. The surface was so far away, but his desperation fueled him. He surged upward, each movement slower, more labored, but he couldn't stop. The water churned, violent and unforgiving, but he pushed through, his chest aching for air. And then his hands broke the surface. The moonlight was blinding, but it didn't feel like the freedom he had hoped for. He gasped, his breath ragged, his body trembling with the effort to stay afloat. He was alive, but the nightmare wasn't over. The creature's roar echoed in the distance, rising from the depths, a sound that shook him to his core. He turned, eyes wild, searching for some sign of salvation. But the water around him seemed to stretch forever, a dark abyss with no end. And there, just beneath the surface, its eyes glowed again. The man's breath caught in his throat as the creature's shadow moved beneath him, slow and deliberate. It was circling him. It wasn't finished with him yet. His pulse quickened as the fear gripped him once more. Every instinct screamed at him to swim, to escape, but his body was weak, drained from the relentless struggle. And then, a ripple in the water. Something large broke the surface. Something impossible. The creature's head. It was massive, its jagged teeth gleaming in the moonlight. Its eyes locked on him with malevolent intent. The man could see it now, its entire form emerging from the depths, a grotesque nightmare made real. He froze, unable to tear his eyes away. It was real. It had followed him. It had always been here. With a sudden surge of strength, he swam. No, he fled, his heart pounding, desperation flooding his veins. But the sea wasn't done with him. The waves crashed violently around him, dragging him down with each passing second. He fought, but the creature was faster, its enormous form closing in with terrifying speed. The water grew colder, colder than it ever had before. The sea tightened around him like an unforgiving vice, and the darkness rose again, consuming everything in its path. As the creature's monstrous jaws opened wide, the man realized there was no escape. This was the end, the Lusitania's curse, and he, too, would become another lost soul. The creature lunged, and the sea claimed him. The water was shockingly cold, colder than before, as if the sea itself had frozen in time. The man's body, battered and broken, floated in the depths, his limbs stiff and unresponsive. The weight of the water around him felt oppressive, suffocating. But the creature was still there. He could feel its presence, dark and looming just beneath the surface, waiting for the final moment. His heart, though slow, still beat. It was a steady, faint rhythm in the endless void. The sea whispered, but now it wasn't the same whisper. It was full of hunger, full of waiting. A soft lapping sound from the surface, followed by a silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. And then the light. A soft glow, like the distant echo of a lighthouse. The man didn't know how, but he could sense it, like a beacon that had always been there, hidden beneath the nightmare. A voice, different this time, reached him, soft but unmistakable. Not yet. The words barely registered at first, but they sliced through the depths of his consciousness like a lifeline. He wasn't done yet. With a burst of energy, he moved, his body fighting against the pull of the deep. His arms broke the surface first, followed by his chest, and then with a great heave, his head emerged. He gasped, the air sharp and cold in his lungs, filling him with a strange sense of clarity. The world above was vast, untouched by the horrors below. He blinked, the ocean's dark expanse now stretched out before him like a vast, uncharted wasteland. The sky was clearer than it had ever been, the stars above twinkling as if they knew what had happened. There was no sign of the ship, no hint of the creature's looming form. But there was something else, something he couldn't ignore. A ship, far in the distance, a silhouette against the horizon.